But I just want to explain first right off what this bill does. It takes partial coverage of IVF and it would put it into full coverage under PHP.
IVF has a higher success rate than other treatments, but it is significantly more expensive than other treatments. Providing coverage for qualified assisted reproductive technology cycles would allow many couples who struggle with infertility, including us, to start and grow their families without adding financial burdens or the need to look for a new job.
I'm sure in your lives and his mind, we've heard growing up that the world overpopulation was going to be the problem. Yet we know without a doubt our greater concern is global decline of population, and it's because the fertility rates are going down at a drastic level. There's an economic winner that comes from that, and you might think, well, that's just too far off. Well, our kids and grandkids are going to experience it.
My wife and I were at BYU, and we had fertility issues for 5 years. And we would take the bus from BYU to Sandy, to the Reproductive Care Center. And we went through every fertility treatment you could go through, all the way down to me selling books door to door to save up enough money to do in vitro fertilization. And as a result, I have my oldest 15-year-old twin boys, and I have my 12-year-old boy. And there's no greater hell that we went through as a young married couple than not understanding why we couldn't have children and not being able to afford to do it. I'm sorry. Looking at this bill, where there's already a $4,000 benefit provided, where this would replace that benefit, I can't think of something more kind that we can do for our public employees who are insured through through PEHP than to provide this opportunity to be a parent. And I would encourage all of my colleagues to support this bill. Thank you.
Can I reply to this?
Yeah.
And
So this is what makes it so difficult to even have the conversation, because you're dealing with people who, rightly, I mean, it's heartbreaking. His emotion and everything that he's communicating, I believe, is legitimate. It's not just, for show. It is painful to deal with it. And so when we address this, it's awful hard to do it in such a way that we don't come across as heartless. But what is lacking in that kind of response is, and certainly you see it here, they have an agenda and they're trying to get this bill through, but you have the same conversations in front of an IVF clinic, and it's that how dare you suggest that my pain that I experienced because of infertility should not be remedied by this science that can fix it. And what's lacking in this kind of discussion at this point is the science and the reality of the practice that they are sacrificing so many embryos to get to those two children that he had. So we don't know how many cycles that he went through. They could have gone through as many as 3 or 4 per child. Even trying to calculate the amount of embryos that were sacrificed in only his process alone is kind of mind numbing. But I guess the one thing to say is how you transition that conversation is always, affirming that those two children that he has are created in the image of God, and that they are precious, and the manner of conception does not affect the value of that human life. And so, I'm glad that he's got 2 children. I think in God's providence, they would be here regardless. But nevertheless, they're beautiful, I'm sure, and they're wonderful people. So we're not saying that that they aren't. And when we're having this kind of conversation, but we are trying to also bring out the humanity of all of these others that are never, very rarely, if ever, talked about.
It is interesting too, in this hearing, how he went right into the testimony, and it's the emotional testimony, right? He was having a hard time holding on to his emotion and tears in it. So he's already pulling on, the heartstrings, giving that testimony to uh,
Yeah.
this is what we should do. This is a part of the committee hearing where you're supposed to ask questions to find out things. This, I support the bill, and I'm asking you to support the bill. That comes later in the committee.
Okay.
But right now, he's skipped all of that. Now, just to end the background, I've already talked to, or I've sent this a pre-email to everybody on the committee here so that they would know what where I was coming from. But I wrote the email, had it written, read to make sure I wasn't coming across abrasive. I wanted it to be in a very loving way, and I tried to explain this to him, not knowing who had been in IVF. And actually, the two that talk about it here later, him and someone else, is have been through IVF, and I didn't know that at the time. So, but that's the thing, you really don't know somebody's background when you're explaining it. So, you want to approach this in the same way.
It seems to me that every argument that's made for how precious their children are, and they are, is an argument for how precious all those children are. So are his two that were allowed to be placed in a womb and born more precious than the ones that weren't? And the answer would be no. They were all fearfully and wonderfully made. And then no one's discounting, at least I'm not, I don't really know, you guys aren't discounting how precious his children are or anyone else's children are. But those are all arguments for how precious all of those babies were.
Pro-life industry and stuff is, they say they want to end abortion, but what they're doing, and the same thing as in IVF, they're not considering those ones that are lost equally as valuable as the ones that are born. And I know they're not thinking that, and they would say, oh no, that's not the case. But that, when you look at it from the outside of looking in, it's like, yeah, it is, because you're killing these to have these.
Yes.
Yeah, I get what you guys are doing. My wife and I have been married 3 years. We've been trying for that long, and she's really got her heart set on having her own baby, as every woman would. I've kind of realized after that first year that it may not be God's plan for me to have a baby and to give adoption a try, but wasn't really getting too far with her on that conversation. So she wanted to give this a try. We're on our third try, and I told her, I didn't think about all the discarding and what they do with it afterwards, because we're pretty conservative, and we know about all the the things they're doing with just babies in general, like live babies and stuff, and the demonic forces and things going on behind the scenes. So, but we never really thought about it as far as IVF wise, like embryos and things like that. We always think of abortions, and even after just a human child sacrifices. But I pretty much convinced her that after this time that we're going to adopt. And and even reading in your pamphlet, I forgot about how who was it? Noah? No, not Noah. It was Abraham that couldn't conceive Sarah.
Yeah,
I think it was.
Yep.
And you also have it with Hannah in 1 Samuel too. Yeah. She cries out to God, and he grants her a child.
Right.
She was in anguish and pain of infertility.
Yeah. And we also have to think of our own, our sins and our iniquities. He may not be. It's not saying he's not blessing us because we're not doing the right thing. It's just that if you want to allow something to happen, allow him to perform a miracle in your life, you have to really open your heart to him, really do his will, and
trust him, right?
Things that I've myself and my wife has slipped away from, like falling into the temptations of this world and the sins of the flesh. So that being said, we're kind of I'm reading the Bible every day. I've got a buddy that I'm going to his house. We're having Bible study every day, and it's not a coincidence you guys are here, and I'm, getting back in the Word, and this is a storm in my life right now. Trying to have a baby, and so
Yeah.
I'll probably talk to her going home today, just because we didn't have any that we could freeze up till last time, the second time, and then we did the genetic testing, which I don't know what's all involved in that because it looks pretty invasive.
Yeah,
I saw like a needle poking and pulls out and it stretches so much. And,
right.
I told her, why don't we just have the baby without the testing and whatever happens, and but she wanted testing. It came back abnormal, and they discarded it. So I don't know. They made us sign a thing saying that they'll discard it. I don't know what they'll do, what that means. And you never know. With today's world, discarding might mean doing stuff to it and testing.
You don't know.
Yeah. So you play kind of a risky game when you go into, you think of abortion clinics. You don't really think of IVF clinics. And
IVF is controversial. It seems like it would be non-controversial, but it is controversial. There's a lot of people feel like there's moral implications here related to what about all of the extra eggs and everything. And I don't completely pretend to understand all of it, but I hear these things and sometimes it makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, I do know of people who have greatly benefited from IVF and some of these other kinds of procedures that help families have children. So I am a little bit torn between those two things, but I'm probably, I'll wait till discussion, but I don't think it's as simple as that. There's a lot of other things to consider with this whole procedure. And so I'll just stop at that. Thank you.
Okay, let's go because this is something to talk about. Go ahead and say that when you're ready. 3, 2, 1, go.
Yeah, it's not about the eggs. We're not talking about eggs. We're talking about embryos. Eggs are human gametes. You've got sperm that's human gametes. It's not a human life until there's fertilization. And it is interesting to me once you get into the political side of this and you start talking to politicians, like how much education you have to do. There's often the average American citizen thinks these people are really smart. They got all this staff that work for them and, they do all this research. It's not true. They just kind of wing it. And this is a good example, even just it might seem like a small thing. It's not a small thing because an egg is not a human life. It's a human gamete that will help create human life. So misspeaking on that already shows you that there's an ignorance of what this process is.
The first thing he says is like, hey, this is controversial. I don't know about it. He proved it by the way he was talking about it. And then he says, well, I don't know. A lot of people have problems. I'll wait till later to talk it about the discussion part, which he goes on to end up voting for it. But the whole thing is, I don't know anything about it. I'm completely uneducated. I know it's controversial and I know there's some problems with it. It all sounds, logical when people tell me about these controversial parts, but I'm going to go ahead and pass it anyway. And this brings up a good point that Pastor Chuck said to them later. You'll see, he says, hey, if you don't know, my suggestion is table it, find out more about it. And that's what I would say to everybody. Table it, find out more about what you, and going back to what you said, it's so involved. It's not one discussion. It's learning about it and understanding it. And when you do, that's when you're, whoa, I had no idea. That's what happened to me.
One thing I'd like to say I think I'll use the word in his defense is he's the only one that acknowledged that, I might have just learned something last night on an email. He didn't give the details of where he learned it, but he may have read your email and been a person that had been positive about it all his life, ever since we heard of IVF. And yet he took what you said seriously enough to bring it up in public and took that little bit of risk to be the only one. He was the only one that had anything at all out of line with everyone else. And I do want to commend him for that, even though he was honest. He said, I just don't know. I don't know that much about it yet. And I appreciated that about him.
My name's Chuck Bickle. I'm the pastor at Faith Baptist in Layton, Utah, and I'm speaking for myself and the Conservative Pastors Coalition of our state. I know this is a very hard thing. 6 months ago, I had been 100% for it. I had no idea what all happens with in vitro fertilization. I thought it was as simple as a beautiful couple wanting to have a beautiful baby, and it's a beautiful thing. And I learned from a couple at our church who said when they went to in vitro, the only way we're doing this is if you put every single egg back in me that you take out. I didn't know the significance of that at the time. And since I've learned that there's generally many, many more eggs taken, then they're graded. Some are used for scientific experiments. And I believe that Jesus Christ is the creator of the universe, that he's the giver of life and the sustainer of life, and that he is life and he is light. And at the very moment of conception, there's a burst of light. And at that point, that becomes a human being. And we're responsible because there's God-given rights to human beings. And we're responsible to provide that human being with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I don't come with a mean spirit. I hope you can tell. I feel very bad for you. This is a big thing. I think that most of you, and I may be wrong, but I think most of you haven't had the opportunities to really look into it, to see what happens. And I think what we need is some changes with this whole process where, like that couple in our church said, we'll take 5 eggs, we'll fertilize 5 eggs, we'll place 5 eggs back in my wife, but I'm not going to participate in playing God and destroying human life. And I hope you can hear that in my heart. I'm really happy for you. I am so happy for the couple from our church, and I pray for this young lady back here that she gets to have a baby. But we have to be responsible for human life, and our Constitution, not only the Bible, but our Constitution supports that. So that's my minute and a half, I guess.
All right, Pastor, I think we have a question for you, Representative Perucci.
Thank you. So, using that logic, I just have a question as someone who's used IVF. Women slough off fertilized eggs regularly. So, how does that add up with that logic? If an egg's fertilized, but naturally they slough off in the process.
This is what I talked about earlier with human life, right? They look at one human life differently than they do others.
You run into this objection pretty frequently at the IVF clinics. Almost the first thing they'll say, well, the natural course of things, if you have fertility, you often lose fertilized eggs. And that's really where she's going with this. Mm-hmm. And the issue there has to do with the fact that there's a big difference between, what happens in the natural course of marriage and reproduction and the one egg that fails to implant versus taking, I don't know, anywhere from 12, 14, 15 eggs, or maybe less, depending on how many they get, and then knowingly sitting down, signing paperwork and paying money to create those human lives that you're running a numbers game to get some that you can hold on to, and knowingly sacrificing a certain amount. That's a whole other thing. And that's when you start having that conversation with people in front of the clinics, it's really fascinating how they will start to at least admit it. And often they will be humble enough to say, well, okay, yeah, that did happen. But that argument is very common in front of clinics and anywhere you talk about it.
Your perspective of 5 in the womb and all of that's really how people look at this, is like there's only 5, but we know that there are a lot. And I know you know more about it now just because every day you're looking at it. There are a lot of lives lost, but that's exactly what you said is, look, we don't know. And I really appreciate that you were like, hey, look into this.
Just seems to me like there's a big difference between what God allows to happen naturally and human beings making those choices instead of allowing God to make those choices, which I tried to say, but I don't know if I said it right.
You feel like you can't say it right, to where they'll hear you, because they don't have those ears to hear.
That's what it felt like.
Yeah.
Wow.
If I could give you any advice, it'd be table it. Go check into it. Make sure you know what you're voting on so that next year you're not coming back here and going, ugh, I realized that I voted for something that I didn't fully understand what I was voting for. But
Can I ask then how you feel about taking insulin for a diabetic? I guess
I would take it if I
just
was
trying to
diabetic.
follow through because does God want that person to die because their sugar can't get into the membrane? Like, I guess I'm just having a hard time following this. And I would just say is I think there are some of us who are intimately in tune with this issue. And so I respect you and your opinion, but I'll tell you, I, as a faithful woman, we felt prompted to do IVF. So I don't want any of the people in this room who are working on IVF to feel like God is condemning them for that. And there are many eggs that are fertilized that are sloughed off through a woman's natural cycle.
But they're not sold. They're not used in experiments.
The way that, so
They're
when you
not-
talk about digging into this, if someone wants to go through it,
Yeah, that's not. Yeah.
okay.
Okay, I
All right. I think I have one more question though.
It is the natural next objection once you deal with the other. And so they'll say, what about science just generally? Do you not take, I had a guy ask me, do you not, have you never in your life ever had to take medicine for something? And so the natural, what they're presupposing is they're presupposing that it's just another medication. However, if I'm taking a medicine that is based on a certain amount of child sacrifice, there's a problem. And on the other hand, what they'll say is, well, God allowed this technology to be here, and so therefore he must want us to engage in it. Well, the logic there breaks down pretty quickly. We also have the technology to do, sex changes. Does that mean that God wants everybody to have a sex change? The morality of the thing depends on what is actually happening in the process, in the scientific process that you're talking about. And so, yeah, it's we're not against medicine. That's not the issue. The issue is that we're against, and this is why, like she did, if you'll notice in that clip, she sort of wanted to go there, acted like it, at least like she wanted to talk about that what happens with the embryos. I don't know if they reined her in or something. Is that what happened?
Yeah.
They reined her in.
They did.
So, that would have been an interesting conversation to have at that point to see what she would say. But probably something about viability. But yeah, I mean, the issue, we always have to keep bringing it back to, these are human lives by the definition of embryology textbooks. They say it. They say life starts at fertilization. Therefore, no loss of human life is acceptable if we're going forward with that.
I wanted to say something I can't get away from, and that is that the whole reason we give insulin is we value the preservation of human life. The whole reason we have a cancer surgery is we value the preservation of human life. The whole reason we do the chemo, the whole reason whether it's the best treatment or not, why do we go to all those efforts, and why does science work so hard? Because of the value of human life. The Bible says in Proverbs 31:8, open thy mouth for the dumb and the cause of all such as are appointed to destruction. And that's all I was trying to do is, look, the reason we try to save a person with diabetes is we value human life. I want you to value all that human life. I think God wants us to value all of that human life. And so these arguments that you're giving me about the value of human life, that's the same argument I'd like you to consider for these little babies. And I don't know exactly why. I think you said it right. They did not have ears to hear. They couldn't hear that. They couldn't connect those two things. That no, we go out of our way to save human life because it's precious, it's valuable, it's a gift from God, it's a miracle of God. Okay, let's go out of our way to save human life. What are we doing in a process that kills many more or any more or any at all knowingly? There's no way to go through this process, is my understanding now, without the killing of little babies, So it never got to that point in their minds. They didn't, I could not get them to connect those two things. And I don't know if I didn't do it right or if it was just they weren't going to listen. I don't know.
That really was a great response. Table this and look into it. I mean, because it's obvious they either don't know. In the case of the two that have done it, I suspect that they do know, and they just don't want to have that conversation.
But what I did want to point out was how she had said, as a faithful woman, we felt prompted. That is very Latter-day Saint. I prayed, I had a feeling, I did it. And that is very Latter-day Saint, going to your feelings, but it does not align with God's word. I did want to point that out, that's what we're dealing with in Utah.
I happened to look to see what the church handbook says about IVF. In 2020, they updated it on this section on birth control and issues related to fertility. And in section 38.6.9 on fertility treatments, they changed it to say the pattern of a husband and wife providing bodies for God's spirit children is divinely appointed. When needed, reproductive technology can assist a married woman and man in their righteous desire to have children. This technology includes artificial insemination and in vitro fertilization. And then it says the church discourages artificial insemination or in vitro fertilization using sperm from anyone but the husband or an egg from anyone but the wife. Now that sounds good, but then the next sentence says, however, this is a personal matter that is ultimately left to the judgment and prayerful consideration of a lawfully married man and woman. That made me think of what she said about, being faithful, right? She was a faithful LDS member. She's been praying about it. She went ahead and did that. And so that out that they give them there with that sentence, even if you have IVF using someone else's sperm or someone else's egg, would still be okay because you prayed about it and you're being faithful. And so it just does really expose the moral relativism that is behind all of this, the authority of the LDS church. It's just really left to you, and that the whole system's based on it, all the way back to Joseph Smith's vision. But yeah, I just want to make a comment on
that. You had mentioned the words "playing God." Again, all the modern advancements in cancer, insulin, and diabetes, the advancements of medication, and to become educated to be able to bless the lives of many people. So who are you or I to determine what Kate's motive would be when she goes in to make that decision with her doctor on how many eggs she wants to fertilize and what she does and what she allows? If we want to have that conversation, we can go and we can have that conversation somewhere else. That's not what this bill is about. And I stand with Representative Perucci that I want to send a message of hope to anyone who may be feeling feelings of despair, that their state has their back, and that we want to be there to be a help to them, for them to realize parenthood. And I think
I just think it's fair that you get to hear.
All right, we're going to stop right here. Thank you, Pastor.
They don't want you to be confrontational because that attracts attention. And if you are less confrontational and you're kind and you just be quiet and let it go, then it's kind of a nobody sees it. Nobody sees what's actually going on. And you can see that in our room, right? When you're speaking, look behind you. The only people there are the people that came with you. That room is completely empty. We're talking about what I would say and what Pastor John has said, the next row. This could be the next Roe versus Wade. And there was nobody in that room to talk about the bill. They didn't want to hear it, and nobody really cared about it. But this is a pivotal point. And it's an important bill, but it's quiet.
Hi, I'm Gail Hansen. I have 10 grandchildren, and I represent myself. I don't represent my 10 grandchildren. 2 of them were conceived because of intervention with fertility problems. And I just want to say, in October of 1985, a man who was then an elder in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Russell M. Nelson, said, "Your spirit receives a body at birth," which means that pre-birth, it is a body, but it doesn't belong to a spirit. And that's what I have to say.
That's just an LDS belief. And so that kind of gives them an okay to do this as well. It's like for that argument, it gives them the right to be able to have the abortion up until birth. If they pray about it and they have agency over it, then they can do that because it's not truly a human being up until birth. In the writing of the laws that they have and way LDS doctrine or their writings say is okay, it actually does happen, and it has happened.
The earlier legislator said something along the lines of, that's when you brought up the issue of experimentation. He said, that's not what we're talking about here. Well, actually it is, because the bill, I'm sure, does not distinguish at all about that. If they're going to pass a bill that forces the insurance companies to cover it for anyone who wants it, that's exactly what you're talking about here. And I just thought of that while this guy was saying it, that, yeah, well, they don't want to admit that's what this is, but you are going to include it, whether you want to admit that or not.
Thank you. My name is Joe Leary, and I am representing myself as a person who has eggs, and who has children. And I think that these sorts of personal medical decisions should not be something that somebody else is making for you. They are very personal and very emotional and very important. And I think that these discussions that are happening between people and their doctors should be just that, between people and their doctors. I'm also a taxpayer, and I am happy to pay for in vitro fertilization for people like Kate.
All right. Thank you, ma'am.
If you watch the IVF influencers that are on social media, they will all of them say that this is women's reproductive health. It's healthcare, and they use all of that same terminology, and they all decry the overturn of Dobbs, or the overturn of Roe with Dobbs. And so they make no bones about it. Like, we are with the pro-choice industry. Well, they have to be, because they without abortion, without the ending of human life, they don't exist.
And we have one online, and we'll do that, and then we'll close public comment. So Chris Martinson, go ahead and turn your camera on. Tell us where you are, who you represent, and we'll hear what you have to say.
Where you got to understand, going into this is hard to see online. The way they do it, they don't show you the clock, they don't show you anything. But it's very confusing online on when to speak. I want to be respectful to them, so they make it confusing, and I wasn't able to speak. I did get my emails out earlier in the day, but when you get into a committee, their minds are made up. As you can see, their minds are made up. There's a discussion, but I don't think the committee is a good place to stop a bill. Stopping a bill from happening is meeting with your legislators, getting people to understand what's going on, and email the representatives way before it gets to committee. Because when it gets to committee, it doesn't really have too big of an impact. And also, just to say, there are how many? 13 people in this committee at the table right now, and the chair is speaking, and you have Representative Perucci and Representative Thompson. Those are the only two that are speaking. You have 13 people on this panel, and none of them are speaking. And actually, some of them got up and left because they didn't want to vote on it and show that they were against it. But here we go with me.
Your time
started. I hope that you all have read my statement that I sent to you online. I also texted it to you, or have possibly watched my movie, The Moral Dilemma, about IVF. Not many people I've talked to understand the true process of IVF, including tonight, even by some of the committee members talking about some of those issues, even though they've been through it. And I do want to tell you that I want to be compassionate and graceful to you, but to understand it is very important, and how to be honest about it. And in IVF, babies are killed throughout the entire process, both intentionally and unintentionally. And most will say, not me. I've done it ethically. There's no possible way to do it ethically. From testing and killing those that have Down syndrome, that's the second day. Oftentimes the parents don't even know that, which is actually illegal in the state. It happens every day here, killing Down syndrome babies that are tested. And it does go past that to eye color, boy and girl. Some don't want that, but then on to science, where they combine those embryos with
Please sum it up, sir. Your time's about up.
All right. Well, just throughout the IVF, it's abortion. So making healthcare IVF, that's the next Roe versus Wade, and it's being asked to be paid for by us and everyone else, including this.
Thank you, sir. We got it. We got your message.
We'd had this conversation before, and he didn't. This is when we were having this conversation in the very beginning. This is when he was saying, I'm done talking to you if you're against IVF. But I actually got out more than I thought I was going to be able to get out.
IVF clinics.
And it's not talked about as much, and it's not addressed in the pulpit like it should be in
really
America.
not.
Yeah.
And and it's right. If God doesn't open up the womb, it's not your time. It's not His purpose. And
Yeah, he opens and closes the womb like he's sovereign over it.
Right, because I've prayed about this with my wife for years, and we were I was on the fence about it. She was always like, "Well, let's just start IVF," but I was like, are we playing God here? And I talked to my fellow Christians friends, and they're like, God uses things even if it was invented for bad things for the good. People are here today because of that, but
A lot of people are killed because of it too.
Right.
The ones that live, they just want to focus on the life that exists now, outside of the womb that made it, but they don't focus on the millions of babies that have died in the process.
Right.
It's really sad.
Yep. And so I've really got I'm taking this into consideration on going forward, because she's going to be starting her the hormone treatments before the retrieval here in the next week or so.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a lot physically.
Yeah, it is. And she's been through it twice, and every time we get that bad news, it kind of...
Right.
And I struggle with addiction, so every time that happens, I'm like, oh man, I want to pick up the bottle again.
Right.
So
something I say to people is what you have to think about is the emotional drain on this.
Yeah.
Because it's the hormones, but then the failures, and if you transferred and then it failed, right? I mean, that happens all the time. So it was loss all the way along.
Oh, and yeah, that's what I even talked to her about. It was we haven't even gotten past many of the hurdles. If we were to have a problem mid-carriage, then that would be even more traumatic.
Yeah, no doubt.
So, but man, as I'm, opening this relationship with God and Christ, I feel like I'm trying to listen more than I am, because I've always prayed growing up, even during my addictions, that, it's like sending an email, thank you for this, thank you for that, please give me this, please that, and then you don't really develop that relationship. You don't listen. He's still, per se. And I'm praying that he'll talk to me and show me what I need to do, because maybe I kind of wrote my body too hard, and now I can't produce, and maybe he used that for good, and he wants me to adopt. Because there's so many kids out there that
right, that's true.
And I'm just going to say something as the chair, because I have the podium, and so I'm going to say it. I've got a beautiful nephew, and I have him because of this procedure. And this is a beautiful family that wanted a child for years and years and years. And we have a lot of children going to families that don't want them. So as far as the moral aspects of this, every time I hold that little boy, I don't see any moral aspects. I just see a beautiful little boy. All right, Representative Malloy.
They can sum everything up with the emotional argument, and then just say something like this, that I have a child, end of discussion. And I keep thinking back to these ancient civilizations that engaged in human sacrifice in order to be more fertile, so that they would have a fertile culture, that their culture would produce children. And it's the same thing. It's the exact same thing. As long as we get the fertility, we don't care one bit about how much human life is sacrificed because I can hold my nephew. And that I think has to be addressed. I try to address it in IVF clinics and say, do you see what you're saying? Like by that point in the conversation, we've already crossed a lot of ground. You can't do that right out of the gate, but that's where I want it to go, because I want them to see that's what you're saying. And I don't know, I think you talk about blindness, like I think it's a cultural blindness. I think it's sweeping across this country that uh, having a child is a right. You hear that quite frequently from people who promote surrogacy, and like the trans communities that want to have children, and the homosexual communities. If I want to have a child, that's my right. We don't have a right to a human life, to some other human life. That's where trafficking comes in. And so, like, when it all boils down to this, the only other thing that I'd like to make an observation here, and you guys will know better about this than me, but it seems like in the LDS community that everything is about like emotion. Like if you go to a ward on Sunday and people are giving their testimonies about Joseph Smith and how they agree with that, they're practiced. They do it every week. And this whole thing about giving testimony and having an emotional element in their testimony, they're big on emotion. And this plays right into that, I would think. Yeah, like maybe better than almost anything else, because now we're talking about children. Who doesn't want you? You don't want me to have a child, And so, yeah, just a couple of things that jump out at me there.
What I see is it's difficult because we don't see any loss. We don't it's hard for us to enter into God's economy. It's hard for them anyway, especially since they've already had a baby born. I'm sitting here trying to think of how to illustrate it. Like if Walmart had 22 laptops and you walk in and walk out of the store with 20 of them, and they come after you like, what are you doing? What do you mean, what am I doing? I left you 2 laptops. What's your problem? You still have 2 laptops. Well, no, I'm missing 20 laptops. Those are my laptops. And see, in God's economy, those are God's children. Every one of those children was conceived miraculously by Almighty God. And these folks are going, well, I got 2 of them, so who cares about what happened with the 20? Well, God does. You entered into God's economy and took 20 of his kids that he miraculously created, and you didn't care about it because you got 2. And you don't seem to have any heart for the loss that God's taken. And you're just totally focusing on the gain that you've received. And I don't know, I'm just sitting here trying to figure out how to illustrate it, and that's what came to my mind. But I know there's probably holes in that. But we've got to enter into God's economy to understand how God feels about things.
I have an illustration I came up with in front of the IVF clinic. If a bus pulls up on the side of the road and you've got 30 kids in there, and you go in there and you start asking, tell me about your parents. What do they do for a living? Give an IQ test to the kids. Figure out their health. Look at them. Are they attractive? Do they have the hair color you want? The eye color you want? Are they a boy or a girl? Go through that whole bus and pick one, and then get off the bus and tell the driver, okay, I got the one that I want. Now go ahead and do what you want with the rest of them. And he kills the rest of them. I mean, like, I think those kinds of illustrations are super important because we have to communicate. You're right. The idea is exactly right, to communicate the idea of scale, and I think that is important. I like the laptop thing too. I mean, anything to get across the idea of the absurdity of valuing one and having no concern for the rest.
As far as I'm concerned, as far as what this bill does and what it is for, is to help families have children. And so I'm going to support this bill, but I admit that this is not an easy topic. And there are things on the moral side of things that make me very, very uncomfortable, and some of these things have been mentioned. But I also love the fact that families that probably never would have been able to dream about having children have children today and will have children. And so I can't forget that either. So I support the bill. Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chair.
you, Representative. Representative Perucci.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to clear up a couple of misnomers here. When you go through IVF, at the end of the process and after you're taking care of your embryos and you pay to have those embryos stored, you actually go through similar to as if they were children, in that you're acknowledging custody of those, and you and your spouse determine what happens to those embryos. And so I promise you that families who go through IVF more than anyone in the world are grateful to have those children. 1 in 8 couples have infertility issues in Utah. In fact, it's higher than that. And so I just want to make sure it's clear. There is consent with what happens with your embryos, and you can decide there what happens with those children. And then also, to say we don't understand it, I promise you this committee, actually, we are more than the 1 in 8 when you look at that. And as someone who has had, intermuscular shots for 3 months and has taken all sorts of medications and had my vaginal wall punctured, I promise you I know intimately the sacrifice that goes into this. And so I just want to make sure we're being honest here and what actually happens. And no doctor would recommend that you implant multiple ones. They want to make sure that you're taking care of the mom and the baby. And so I think this is fantastic. We pride ourselves on being a pro-family state. Starbucks, Goldman Sachs, all offer this. And so if we want to be competitive and, again, put our money where our mouth is, I think this is a good move to show that we really do believe in families in Utah. And I'd ask for my colleagues' support on it.
She didn't talk like she really understood what we're saying, but you're right. She might very well know. And she says that she believes in life at fertilization. As a matter of fact, on another bill that she's running right now, I talked with her about earlier in the session, was that they have a prison bill, and she wants to give birth control to prison inmates, female prison inmates, when they come in. And it goes in deeper than that. But my concern with it was, I told her, I said, if you're going to give government paid birth control to these prison inmates, and they listed the types, there was abortifacients on those. And I said, you're giving prison inmates abortifacients, which mean you're giving state paid abortions to these inmates. And that would go against people that don't want to pay for abortions. And she said, you know what? She said, you're right. I never thought about that.
Huh.
He agreed with that. And she took that to the session. I don't know how it ended up. They're still in session now, but he agreed with it there. She doesn't agree with it here. It's the same thing. So
you're probably right then. Maybe she doesn't understand it, because that's pretty unusual.
They talk differently than things that they really know. So it's hard to know, but.
Thank you. Discussion of the motion, Representative McPherson.
Generally speaking, I support this bill, but I'm very concerned about the cost sharing, because this is going to be something that every public employee is going to take on, and the taxpayer will fund right now in order to provide a benefit. But I think it's a good benefit. We want more families, and we want bigger families here in Utah. So I will support this bill, this vote.
All right. Congratulations, Representative. That's unanimous.
I knew one in particular that I've been spending a little more time with, and had even come to the Bible study that I taught that morning at the Capitol at 7 a.m. But you know what I didn't notice is the person right next to him got up and left as well.
Table what you're doing, find out more about it. I think that's the best advice of this entire thing, is learn more. And it's not just a one discussion thing. Give me this point and convince me in a minute and 30 seconds. There's a lot more to it.
Yes.
Very, very, yeah, like you say about it being the new row.
No.
That's exactly right. You get to that life at implantation, and if that takes root, it makes everything far more difficult for the abolitionists across the board.
Yeah.
So yeah,